Well, good afternoon if you are in New York City, Boston, or Durham, North Carolina. Good evening if you are in Gaul or France, as we should say, where they're having elections and where um, Gaul is going to be a subject today. Good later evening if you are in Amarna in Egypt, and a special good evening to our loved ones in Ukraine. We're with you. We love you. We support you. My guest today, I should say that this is Fred Plotkin on Fridays. That makes me Fred Plotkin on IDAGIO, the place where classical music happens. As you know, IDAGIO is a video and streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. I was so eager to introduce my guest because I want to do a lot with him. He's terrific. His name is Anthony Roth Costanzo. And if you don't know him, you will know him somewhat by the end of this broadcast. I want to make a couple of things clear. This broadcast is on April 29th of 2020. Anthony and I are recording on April 20th, 2020. This is unusual that we pre-record, but we're both busy guys. And Anthony will be performing in Amadigi di Gaul by Handel with Boston Baroque in the weekend of the 22nd of April. And it will be streamed live on IDAGIO on April 22nd and available on idagio.com until May 22nd of 2020. So even though we're recording this before Anthony has sung the role, Anthony, you were terrific.
Thank you. I hope your prophecy comes true.
Okay. So I've known Anthony for a long time. I've known him since before he was a superstar. I've known him, I think, maybe before you were even a star. You were a rising talent with very conspicuous talent. And so I was trying to think, how do I describe this fellow I do know? And the way I came up with it, we always go back to Mel Brooks when we need to have explanations for things. And Mel Brooks spoke about the angel who flies above all the cribs of the newborn babies, giving out a gift here, missing a cradle there. In the case of Anthony, what happened was there were two angels flying about, and one of them bumped into the other, and all of the gifts went into one little cradle, and that was on Anthony. Because how do I describe Anthony? He's intelligent. I wrote this down. He's intelligent. He has good temperament, excellent musicianship, beautiful voice, handsome, good work ethic, congenial, flexible and innovative, unencumbered by convention, entrepreneurial, an outstanding cook from what I have been told. I have not yet discovered it myself. Artistically questing, a superb communicator that I can vouch for among all these other things, a beloved collaborator, and a fine teacher. You have taught in the New York City schools. You have taught at Princeton University. You have taught for the New York Philharmonic. You are not yet 40. I know your birthday. You're not yet 39, as far as I know. So you have done, you're the proverbial young man in a hurry. And you have done so much in your time. And Anthony, actually, the first question I have for you is something else. I typically don't talk about the pandemic on this program. I want it to be more for history. However, your pandemic from a work point of view is different from any other artist that I can think of, at least in classical music and opera, in that you were out there. You were doing things on flatbed trucks with the New York Philharmonic. You were creating all kinds of projects. I created Fred Plotkin on Fridays, basically when most artists were not out doing things, and yet you were. So talk about your attitude when the pandemic hit, what you resolved to do, what you thought you could do, what you decided you shouldn't do, and how you created so much in the 2+ years of the pandemic.
Well, thank you, Fred, and thank you for that amazing introduction. You know, a couple months into the pandemic, I think we were all taking stock of what it was. And everyone was saying, everything had been canceled, of course. And I was carefully following, what was safe. And it occurred to me that there was a way to make live music and for it to be safe and to do it at the highest level. And I was lucky to be able to be on the phone with Deborah Borda, the president and CEO of the New York Philharmonic. And I had this idea. I said, well, why couldn't we take a pickup truck and put a few members of the Phil on the back of it and create these programs that would go all throughout the 5 boroughs of Manhattan. It would give us a chance to connect with audiences we might not normally connect with. And they would be kind of pop-up concerts. So we wouldn't be gathering people. At the time, you didn't want to gather people. It would just be for whoever was there and who heard it. And it could almost be like a litmus test. We'd see how people responded to music in a pure way. And so I proposed a way that this could happen. Logistically, as you can imagine, it was really complicated. And Deborah said, well, why don't you produce it? I love the idea. You put it together, you program it, you produce it, and we'll do it. And so I spent, in 6 weeks, we put together this huge initiative. And we went out over the next 9 weeks and did 81 concerts in New York in all 5 boroughs. And it was so moving to see how much people needed music, how it affected them, how it gave them, the beauty gave them some solace, and the joy of it gave them some excitement. And we didn't have any, COVID scenarios. Luckily, we were very fortunate. We were very careful. We were very strict with our testing. And what we called it, which was Bandwagon, became a kind of movement. It became a kind of emblem that went beyond, even what I had designed for it, although, of course, it was what I had hoped it could be. It was on, television. It was on the CBS Nightly News. It was on Good Morning America. It was in the paper many times. And it became an emblem of resilience in a way. And the importance of art was salient in that. And it changed, I think the Phil would agree, it changed the New York Philharmonic's relationship to New York City and to the city in which it existed, because it provided us an opportunity not just to make do, but to do something to go above and beyond what we would normally do in the field of classical music in ways that were important and in ways that felt, meaningful. And so I think that that was it accomplished a goal, and it became a goal I had for the pandemic, which was not just to do projects that filled the gaps or projects that were a shadow of what we were once doing, but to actually think about what we could do with the constraints that would be even better. And so we went on to make a second iteration of Bandwagon, which was even more complex, and it included a 20-foot video wall that traveled on a larger truck, and we set up camp in 4 different boroughs and 4 different locations, and let our partner curators, an important part of Bandwagon was collaborating with different organizations, be it the National Black Theater or El Puente or Flushing Town Hall, all kinds of different organizations throughout the city. And so, for example, we took this truck to Harlem, and the National Black Theater programmed the week or the weekend sort of festival, and we plugged the New York Philharmonic into that, and we gave them real control. So it was a different approach to collaboration than what the Phil normally does and what I normally do. And it was really exciting to learn and to create in that context. And over the pandemic, I also made an album in a way that I don't think I could have, with the incredible cabaret and just iconic performer in New York, Justin Vivian Bond.
I want to get to her a little later, Anthony, if I can. I want to stick to the Philharmonic for now. In thinking about what you did, I've also been thinking about the New York Philharmonic. I go way back with that company because, I'll keep a long story short, when they opened at what used to be called Philharmonic Hall in 1962, I was a toddler, and my mother worked at Lincoln Center, and it was the only building of Lincoln Center. And there was no such thing as childcare at that time for single parents who had a child. so that I and the toddler children of other Lincoln Center employees were put in the lobby of Philharmonic Hall and watched by a security guard. The conductor of the New York Philharmonic then was Leonard Bernstein, and he came through and saw these little kids and asked, "What are these kids doing here?" And the guard thought the maestro was upset. No, these were kids to be taught. So we were brought inside the auditorium for all rehearsals. And I and about 7 other kids basically had Leonard Bernstein, the New York Philharmonic, to teach us the standard repertory, plus things like Mahler, which was not standard then. And we became the focus group for his famous young people's concerts. So
Wow.
when he died, and then Harvard, where he studied, and the University of Michigan, did oral histories, I was one of the people who spoke about Bernstein in that era. He famously said that Philharmonic Hall had terrible acoustics, and a man named Avery Fisher of the Fisher Electronics Company gave money, and in 1976, the hall was retrofitted. It was renamed Avery Fisher Hall. Fast forward to just a couple of years ago, the New York Philharmonic received a very notable grant from David Geffen, the producer, and the hall has been renamed David Geffen Hall, and they were going to slowly, incrementally do work on changing the acoustics. Then the pandemic hit, and while the pandemic has been an awful thing in just about every way, it was actually good for the redesign of the hall, because with no audiences inside, they could work day and night to make the changes that would have taken years in a shortened period of time. So the New York Philharmonic, once performances resumed in New York City, has not performed there. They've been in Carnegie Hall and many public places. And part of the organization's engagement with the city is what you did. But it's just one part. And I think it's fascinating to see how the orchestra has come to places it was not known, and where frankly it did not know the people.
Yeah.
And I should point out that the New York Philharmonic was opened in 1842, the same year as the Vienna Philharmonic. When people in Europe say, "Oh, you don't have any culture in the United States," I point out that the New York Phil and the Vienna Phil are the same age. And the New York Phil opened Carnegie Hall in 1890. I should know this by heart, 91 or 93. They did Tchaikovsky, Dvorak, and Beethoven. And it is so much a part of the city fabric. And our radio station in New York would broadcast the New York Philharmonic every week. First WNYC, then WQXR. Still does. There is that relationship. And it is the people's orchestra. It's not always perceived that way. And frankly, it doesn't always behave that way, but it is indeed the people's orchestra. And we are deeply, deeply attached to it. So that's why I was very pleased to see that you and they collaborated, because that is, to my knowledge of you, that's your spirit as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. So what, not that you weren't busy, but apart from the album with Justin Vivian Bond we will talk about, and the New York Philharmonic, what else did you do in the pandemic? Because as I said, other artists, I don't talk about their pandemic because they mope, understandably. You did not take that approach.
No, I worked every day on a myriad of different projects, but I taught at 15 to 20 different universities. I taught classes, I did master classes, I gave lectures. I also created online, and I created videos and video content for a lot of different companies, from the Met in their at-home gala to smaller companies and fundraisers and organizations that I'd come into contact with. I tried to help everyone I could in whatever way that I could in our virtual undertakings. But I also I started to develop projects. I worked on a big project I'm producing with Yuval Sharon and the wonderful opera director, and George Lewis, an incredible composer, Douglas Kearney, Mimi Lien. So we began developing a project, or continued developing a project over the pandemic. And of course, I got ready to premiere John Corigliano's opera. And that was one of the first things, the first season out of the pandemic that I did. I performed some live recitals that
Was
were.
that in Santa Fe?
That was in Santa Fe,
Talk
exactly.
about that. Talk about that
Yeah.
opera. Yeah.
That opera was something a long time coming, and it was really still, it was the summer of 21, when the pandemic was sort of just coming out of the worst part. And John Corigliano is an incredible composer. You might know his music from The Ghosts of Versailles, which was, of course, his first opera at the Metropolitan Opera with Tatiana Troyanos and Marilyn Horne and Renee Fleming and all these people. And John also famously
Teresa Stratus, I think you mean, Anthony.
Sorry,
Not
yes,
Troyanos, Teresa Stratus, yeah.
Sorry, you're right, as usual. And then John famously won an Academy Award for the Red Violin and his wonderful score for that, and the Pulitzer as well. He's a brilliant composer, and he's in his 80s. But he's
Can I
only
add
written.
his Symphony Number 1,
Yes.
which the New York Philharmonic premiered, which goes by the name the AIDS Symphony, but I don't think that's a proper name for it, even though it is in recognition of people who were affected by HIV and AIDS, among those who died, but also those who survived. And it's
Exactly.
a masterpiece. Yeah.
It's a masterpiece, and that I think is what he won the Pulitzer for. And John has only written that one opera previous to this one, and that was Ghosts of Versailles. So it was really exciting when he said he wanted to write his second opera for me, and with me in the title role. And he wrote it with his longtime partner, Mark Adamo, writing the libretto. And the libretto was a combination of Euripides the Bacchae and Dracula, which is hard to imagine when you talk about it. But actually, if you start to think about the narrative threads of the two stories, they fit incredibly well together. And what Mark did with it was really interesting. And of course, John's music is absolutely spectacular. And it was thrilling to have a full chorus and a full orchestra with a set and do an opera again. And we were very careful testing for COVID throughout that. But of course, singing the title role in that complicated piece took an enormous amount of preparation and working with John and Mark and getting it where it needed to be. So that
the opera was named Lord of Cries. Is that correct?
Exactly.
And you were Dionysus.
And I was Dionysus.
Yeah.
So that was truly a thrilling return to the stage. But I also, over the pandemic, did things like go to the Phillips Collection in DC and record a recital that was broadcast out live with Brian Wagorn and the wonderful pianist. And so, I wound up being almost busier than ever over the pandemic. I wrote an article for Opera News. I did, every day brought a different and interesting challenge. And so I learned a lot, and I feel like I grew a lot, and I stayed very busy.
And in my descriptions of you, when the angel stumbled over your cradle, among the things I said were entrepreneurial and with a good work ethic.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, but it's true. I recognized that in you when I first met you, when you were a very young man. You're still a young man, but when you were really starting out young man. And not every opera singer, not every person, let's leave out opera singers, not every person combines a good work ethic and being entrepreneurial. The work ethic I get. How did you learn the entrepreneurial part, or was that just a part of you?
Well, part of it has to be a drive that you have, but the drive is really rooted in my desire to make this art form to which many of us are so devoted and enamored as legible as possible to as many people as possible. I, had a lot of diverse experiences growing up, being on Broadway, being in film, going to a university that was very rigorous, running a dance company, working in the art and fashion
I don't know
world.
about the dance company. Talk about that one.
Well, when I got out of college, I had worked with a wonderful choreographer named Carol Armitage, who had choreographed for Nureyev and Baryshnikov and Michael Jackson, you name it. And she'd come to Princeton where I was doing my undergrad, and I'd asked her, after we worked on a ballet of hers together where I sang when I was about 18, I'd asked her to come choreograph and direct a project I was doing at Princeton as an undergrad. And she did, and she saw how incredibly well I organized it. I raised a lot of money for it. I raised money to make a documentary film about it, which later went to Cannes and played on PBS. And so she was impressed with my ability to rally support and to organize and to think, and asked if I would consider being the executive director of her dance company. And so I needed a job out of college. That sounded interesting. And for 2 years I was, and together we raised $3 million for her dance company in those 2 years. And I did every aspect of, a nonprofit job, because there was not really a staff there. So I learned what marketing meant, what press meant, what development meant, what programming, company management, you name it. And that was really edifying. And it drew upon a lot of different interests I had between music, which is of course a big part of dance, but also art and fashion and all of these different things. And it connected me to a very different crowd in New York. And when I was a part of these worlds and these different crowds and these different inspirations, I realized that, these people would love opera if they had a way to connect to it, but they don't often. They needed a sort of a key to open that door. And I became very interested in how to create those points of access for people. And that has been the genesis of a lot of my entrepreneurship, in a way, is to think outside of the box and to forge my own path. I would say I'm also a very practical person. And as a countertenor, I was cognizant of the fact that I wasn't going to sing Carmen or Tosca or, roles that would keep my, bank account full and all of that going around the world. That especially in America, if I wanted to have a successful career, I had to create opportunities for myself and carve my own path. And so that really aligned with my interests and my goals. And I thought there was a way in which those projects I create could speak to an unconventional audience for opera. And so that is what has led me over time to accrue and learn a lot of different skills, first working on my own, then working within and between institutions and trying to understand their limitations, whether it be their board or their unions or whatever it might be, and how we can work with those limitations to shape and create exciting projects that push the boundaries of classical music and hopefully create opportunities for new audiences.
Well, put in simplest terms, the direct question, how do you ask for money?
Well, I think money is about relationships. And, one thing I've learned about people who have a lot of money, and in America, we're lucky that there's tax structures that they're able to give money as a tax deduction. So, not only do they want to give money for that reason, but they want to be involved with the arts and they want to support artists. They're not, in my experience, really interested in just handing over money to a good idea. They want to have a relationship with the people who create it. They want to feel involved in it, and they should be involved in it. And it's got to connect to their personality and their desires just as much as it does to the audience. So you can't sort of, in my experience, approach someone cold and say, give me $100,000, but rather as you get to know people and you develop relationships and you actually become friends with them, then when you have an idea or a project or something exciting, you sit down and you explain it to them, and you say, look, I'd love for you to be a part of it, and I'd love for you to give money to it, if it's possible. And if it's not, I'll come to you with the next one, if it's not the right fit for you. So that's how I've approached it over the years. And I'm not, I really am luckily interested in people, and I like people just like you do. And I want to get to know them. And so I'm not always looking to meet someone just because they have a lot of money or something like that.
One person that I knew a lot of people well, but one I want to mention that I wonder if you ever met him was James S. Marcus. Jim, to me. Jim Marcus, when I worked at the Met, was chairman of the board. He was a wonderful, tough guy, tough in the very good sense, as in exacting, and he didn't throw away his money and he didn't suffer fools gladly, but he really knew opera and was open to the new. He was not in any way a stuffed shirt, to use an American expression. And he, after he left the Met, he of course continued to give money there. He and his wonderful wife, Ellen, built the vocal arts program at the Juilliard School. They're great donors to public broadcasting in the United States. And Jim and Ellen would often go to the tiniest little hole in the wall club in Brooklyn or Queens or Staten Island or the Bronx or parts of Manhattan where normally people of their status wouldn't venture, and sit on hard benches and watch performances by rising artists. And he often called me and would say, well, what do you think of this artist or that artist, including you? And I would give my opinion, and my honest, candid, professional opinion. And I would never say, I think you should give money or not, because that was not my role to do that. But I do know that he often would then contact the person saying, I'm thinking of giving you $5,000, but I want you to come back to me with reports. I want you to tell me how you're using it. He never told them what to do with the money. And he would lay the seeds and the foundations for entrepreneurship in them. And if they were to get more money, they had to report back to him about how they were using the money they had. How did you spend it? Did you engage labor? Did you teach someone? Did you bring on an assistant, a protege, whatever? And he was so active in developing young artists, very young artists, and occasionally finding an older artist who was ignored or forgotten because they were considered yesterday's taste. He and Ellen, Ellen is very modern and sophisticated in this regard. Other people, not so much. I've known people, there was a very famous woman in New York named Alice Tully, who loved supporting artists, but she would do it on a one-to-one basis. So early in Jesse Norman's career, Alice Tully took Jesse Norman in. Not that Jesse Norman needed training from anyone, but she was very open to Alice Tully's worldview and interest and taste, and they developed a relationship. Jim Marcus never imposed his taste. I think he felt it was up to someone else to develop what they do. Alice Tully was about the shared artistic experience. You, when you were talking just now, brought to mind someone who I knew well and worked with, was Beverly Sills, who was a very famous soprano. But I would argue that, great though she was as a soprano, she was a better arts executive, in that she created fundraising models. She had this miraculous touch for getting money out of people. So much so that when she died, that fundraising went with her. I remember one time I was with her in her office when she was running Lincoln Center, and we were having conversation, we were talking about music, and she got up in the middle of a sentence of mine. I thought I must have been very boring, and walked the length of the office and tapped on a computer. Now, this is before we all did this, to check the stock portfolio of Lincoln Center on that day, to see how the money was doing, and then came back and sat down and picked up the thread with me. She was very money focused in the sense that if you can't pay for it, you can't do it. Now,
well, exactly.
She would play it forward, though. She would gamble that she could collect money by X time. I also, the one I was really trained by was artist Kranick, who was the general director of Lyric Opera of Chicago. In her view, if you didn't already have the money, you don't do something. You've
Right.
never risked. Whereas Beverly Sills would risk, and it usually played out, but occasionally, if there was a stock market crash or who knows what, then it didn't.
Yeah.
I'm asking you all this because I want our listeners to know that it's a given that you're an outstanding singer. You may have noticed that I did not refer to you as a countertenor, even though I know you are, in part because I wanted listeners to learn another side of you before we talk about countertenorism, not counterterrorism, as my computer corrects to. Some listeners heard me speak with Randall Scotting on April 15th, and he and I went into great detail about the history of countertenors, castrati, and so on, in part so that you don't have to, because I know that you've done that a lot. Because I want to talk to you about first Amadigi di Gaula, which you have just sung with Boston Baroque, and it was streamed on IDAGIO and will be available until May 22nd, 2022. Handel premiered this at the King's Theatre on the Haymarket in 1715. It was a huge hit. We don't really know who the librettist was. There are four major roles. Amadigi was played by what was called an alto castrato, Niccolo Grimaldi, who was from Naples. Talk about this character, talk about the particularities of the music that you find appealing, and why has it been so seldom done?
It's always a question with Handel, why has it been so seldom done? And I don't know the answer. I think this is some of the most incredible music, and it's one of the magical operas. So there's a lot of magic in the plot, which to me gives directors a license to really dream and be creative. One of the things that I love, you mentioned the castrato it was written for, is that clearly Handel was exploiting one of the traits we hear about castrati, which is that he could hold these long, long notes and do a messa di voce, which is getting louder and then softer again, or these effects on a long note. And the audience was thrilled by just holding a long note in almost every aria. And I think I have 8 in Amadigi. There's one long note. And so you see how tailor-made it was for these castrati, but it's one of these roles that fits my voice incredibly well. And it's a smaller, what I love about it in a way is there are really only 4 characters. And so as opposed to some of the other Handel operas where we get subplots upon subplots, this is much more streamlined. It's early Handel, and what's great about early Handel is that some of the music is incredibly surprising. He takes you in jagged turns. It's not quite as codified in a sort of gallant, elegant Handelian style. It has a little bit more hyped up drama in the harmonic shifts that he writes. And I play basically a knight who is on a quest to find his beloved, and a sorceress stops him and is in love with him and wants to get in his way and prevent him from getting to his loved one. And his compatriot, his Sancho Panza, who's named Dardano, is also in love with his beloved. So that complicates things even further and results in some violence. But it's generally a wonderful piece of music. I encourage you to listen to it because I think it has some arias that you will be surprised you've never heard before because they're so gorgeous.
And Dardano is usually played by a contralto. What will it be in this production?
We have the incredible, I mean, I feel so fortunate, Daniela Mack, who is an amazing singer. And she, has these glorious low notes that rival any countertenor. And she also has an amazing facility with coloratura, but she sings the beautiful Pena Tirana, which is an aria I've sung a lot, but it's sung by her in this production, and she does it so gloriously. It's a lyrical, slow piece. So she does everything, and she's a fantastic actress. It's been such a joy to work with her. The other thing I forgot to mention is, you know, one of the first big pieces I did at the Met was the Enchanted Island, that Baroque pasticcio. And my role was of Ferdinand, and the aria that I sang, I came up on this boat and I held this long messa di voce, and that aria was from Amadigi di Gaula. So returning to it and singing it again has been a real flashback and a wonderful opportunity.
I want to get to Enchanted Island a bit later, but let's stay with Amadigi di Gaula. You said you have 8 arias. In the opera Giulio Cesare by Handel, Cleopatra has 8 arias. And again, we go back to Beverly Hills because I learned that opera with her, and she and I discussed the 8 arias and how, in effect, they are different moods. They're different. They don't move the plot, so to speak, but they're, for the most part, but they're more about her state of being at the moment we hear her sing them. One of them is sort of a seduction aria, but the others are really about her moods. In Amadigi, do they move the plot forward? Are they about the moods of the character? Describe the nature of these arias.
I think the arias themselves are more about the moods, but you know, that is often the case with Handel. And I think what's wonderful about that, and what's wonderful about Handel's da capo style, is it's incredibly human. You know, it is, we call Verismo, we call Verdi and Puccini Verismo opera, in that it's supposed to be more like real life. But actually, we don't move that quickly through our thoughts in real life. You know, if something major happens to us, we could spend days, you know, thinking about it, let alone a da capo aria. And they often refer to the second A section of a da capo as the repeat. But dramatically, it's not a repeat. It's actually motion forward. It's a journey forward. And that's something I discovered early on as a countertenor working in this idiom, is that you have to have a trajectory. You don't just return to the same feeling. You go forward into a different progression of that feeling, just like grief can progress or excitement can grow or wane. And then you ornament you add vocal decorations to that da capo, that repeat or that second A section, according to the progression dramatically. So of course you want to show off your vocal wares, but what does it sound like you're feeling, basically?
So years ago, I did an evening in front of an audience with Joyce DiDonato. We're talking about many things, but primarily about Handel. And she remarked to me that the challenge, but also the pleasure of Handel, is that his markings in the score are not as detailed and explicit as, say, Richard Strauss. And therefore, the singer has to find and invest more of his or her own feelings about what the words say, but also especially what the music says. You have famously pioneered the pairing of Philip Glass and Handel, doing programs called Glass Handel, if I recall, which I think I saw you do in Philadelphia. And how are the markings in a very modern score by a living composer, say Philip Glass, who is famous for his musical style? What does he, the composer, tell you? I mean, on the page, not Philip Glass in person. And what does Handel, the composer, tell you or not tell you when you look at the page?
Well, you know, Glass is famously laissez-faire, which is very much in the Handelian style. Someone like John Corigliano or a lot of other composers that I work with will be very specific in describing a mood or how they describe a tempo or even putting a tempo marking. You know, Handel used fairly standard dance terminology like minuetto or, you know, larghetto or whatever it might be to describe his tempi. But he doesn't put a tremendous amount on the page, because in the time he's writing, he knows that singers are trained in a certain way to know how they want to ornament. And just the same way the continuo players, the harpsichord, the cello, the lute, they're all trained to know how to realize a chord. So sometimes he just writes the bass note, and it's the job of the lute player or the harpsichord player to make that into a chord and figure out what that chord might be. And that, you know, that figured bass that he writes is very skeletal and can be filled in many different ways. What that does, I think, think, is to make his pieces a living, breathing, ever shifting, opportunity for people to express drama as they feel they can. And I like that kind of freedom. You have to know stylistically how to approach it. You have to do it intelligently. But I think it is wonderful. And Glass, what's amazing to me is that Glass is very similar in that he's very bare bones. He'll put in a tempo marking, but even that is sometimes negotiable. And what he does is leave a lot of space in his repetitions, which are different than Handel's, of course, but the same idea of repetitions for the singer to fill in those gaps and to create a narrative and a narrative journey.
So since we're talking about Philip Glass, we'll get back to the Enchanted Island, which I adored, by the way. But you are soon going back to New York, you're in Boston now, to the Metropolitan Opera to reprise Akhnaten by Philip Glass, for which you and your colleagues just won a Grammy Award. Congratulations.
Thank
and you
you.
seem to have flown in the night from Philadelphia to Nevada to pick up the award, and then you went elsewhere. You are apparently, among your talents, as you could be a travel agent in terms of sorting out your travels. But Akhnaten, I'll start with the production. I adore Phelim McDermott, who I think is one of our great stage directors and producers. He did The Enchanted Island. He did Akhnaten. It's a superb production. It exists on video that people can see. I would rather that they go see and hear it in the house. It runs from May 19th to June 10th because it's an all-encompassing experience, and because the Met Orchestra plays it so beautifully, it has to be heard in the house, and because your sound and the sound of your wonderful colleagues is very distinct in the house. Talk about this opera, Akhnaten.
I think it's a transformative opera, both for me and for a lot of the audience members who've attended it and what they've described to me. And I think about why that is, why it has such an impact. But it's an unusual synthesis in my career, for sure, and in my experience going to the opera, of all of the different elements that make opera great. The orchestra and the orchestral writing is utterly unique and really thrilling. The way that the voices are employed in the duet between Akhnaten and Nefertiti, where they overlap and intertwine, in the Hymn to the Sun, where I have to sort of float my voice over brass, which is a very unusual effect, in the large ensembles with the chorus, where there's a kind of almost aspirated repetition of an ah vowel over and over and over again until it becomes trance-like. There are so many elements that are both very unusual and feel very familiar, that make this a ritualistic experience. And when you combine that with what Phelim McDermott has done on the stage, which is to evoke the spirit of ancient Egypt without creating a kind of historically rigorous portrayal. Yeah.
Without walk like an Egyptian.
Without walk like an Egyptian, exactly. I think that is so, it's so alluring. It's so much of a fever dream of what we understand of ancient Egypt and what, the Book of the Dead or the various sources that we use to kind of mine the imagery there referred to. So I think it's an utterly unique experience. As you say, you can get a sense of that in the video and on the recording, which we were very grateful to win a Grammy for, but you also get a totally different and much more magical experience when you see it live in the house. So I encourage everyone, if they're able, to come and do that.
When you were preparing this opera to learn it and to think about it, I know you're a thinker in addition to being a doer. And you traveled to Oxford, England, and met with Richard Parkinson, who's an Egyptologist, and really went deep into the whole topic. What did you learn from him and the other Egyptologists you met at Oxford?
It was so interesting to look at the intersection of academics and art in this way. And really, I had to create Akhnaten in my own way, because glass only puts a skeleton of a story there. And so I had to really learn about who he actually was and think about why was he making these choices. And so when I went to the Oxford archives and I looked at, the watercolor paintings of the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb that Howard Carter made, or when I looked at the actual artifacts from ancient Egypt and how things were carved, what Akhnaten destroyed, what of his reign was destroyed, how people thought about him. And I talked about all of these different things. I started to create in my mind my own image of who this person was. And I think what was exciting for the scholars is they look at the pieces and they try and connect the dots, but they don't often think about the psychology of these people and the living, breathing aspect of who they were. And that's, of course, what opera and art can do more than anything, is they can take this history and make it come alive. And so I think that was it was incredibly thrilling to be able to collaborate with that level of scholar and to find a way to channel that information, almost sometimes without words and without music, but just through the way that you connect to an audience, the way that you engage a performance. You can create a kind of mystical representation.
When we look at the operas of Philip Glass, which cover a vast range of subject matter, one thing that I think we can pick out is that he has taken an interest in famous world figures, many of whom were controversial or forgotten or misunderstood. Gandhi, Einstein, Walt Disney, Christopher Columbus, Martin Luther King, but also the pharaoh who was known as Amenhotep IV, and who reigned from 1352 to 1335 BC. And he moved the capital to Amarna. He was, we think, the first monotheist, and he worshiped the sun god Ra. But then after his reign, the Egyptians returned to polytheism, and much of what Amenhotep, what Akhnaten did, was either canceled or was hidden or destroyed. Therefore, Philip Glass created this template that you, the artist, by the way, you did not premiere this opera. It premiered in 1984. But I think you're an example, like John Vickers with Peter Grimes, that people forget who may have done it before, wonderful though they were, because the matching of artist and role is so distinct that you have come to personify that role, and you. The issues of monotheism, the issues of creating a civilization that's canceled, the tenuousness with which our culture hangs on and then could be destroyed, is what really grabbed me, in addition to the performance and the production, about the story.
Yeah, I think that's fabulous. I mean, I'm curious, when you saw it yourself, how did you approach it? Did you know a lot about it, and how did it change in your eyes and sort of either meet or defy your expectations?
Well, I had read interviews with you in the British press because it was done at English National Opera before it came to New York. I then pretended that I didn't read them because I wanted to come with a virgin brain and eyes and so on, and ears. And I went 3 times in the initial run. And the first time, frankly, was to grasp the music. The second time was to focus on the production. The third time was to integrate the music and the production. I have the luxury to do that. But also have the passion to do that. I think that what I took away from it is what I just described, is how remarkable human achievements can just be destroyed or extinguished or hidden or lied about, so that, if a new culture or religion or belief system comes in to replace the radiant one, I will call it, was something much more benighted. We have to try to find out, number one, what made the original one special, but number two, why were people so eager to destroy it?
Yeah, yeah.
And that's what I took from it, because yes, I could watch the opera Akhnaten as a representation of a story, the way, let's say, Aida is set in ancient Egypt. And I've worked on many productions of Aida, including one in Egypt. And I know that opera inside and out, and it's a masterpiece. But it is a 19th century Verdian and French take on Egypt and Verdi's passions of public responsibility versus private love and passion and contradictions. Akhnaten, the opera, has nothing to do with all of that. It's a whole other story that happens to be in Egypt, just the way Mozart's Die Zauberflöte is set in Egypt. Most people don't know that. And therefore, I don't think of that as an Egyptian opera. But I think that Egypt has become, Thais is set in Egypt by Massenet, but I think that Egypt, like Spain, is sort of an exotic setting that opera composers have used because it was distant to the European audience. Akhnaten, the opera, is different because Glass was not about being Egyptian or explaining Egypt, but explaining, in my view, a culture and a worldview that was very particular to this young man. And he was a young man. He was the boy king, in effect. And I'm always very moved when I watch it, or now I watch it once on video, and I won't do it again for a while because I will be coming to the live performance. I recommend the video for people, but if you can see and hear it in the live house, it's just something otherworldly in the best sense.
Yeah, and I think what you raise is an interesting point. I mean, when you think about the fact that Akhnaten changed the course of history by really, moving monotheism and that idea, maybe creating it and moving it forward, people really hated him for that and felt that, he had destroyed what they had created and their own sense of ritual. So the question can be asked, was he a visionary or was he a cult leader? Was he good or was he bad? And I try and ask those questions as I personify this, and we do in the opera. And I don't know that we answer that. And it's hard to know the answer. So there's mystery maintained, but obviously the audience forms a connection to the character and to the different people. And so it really does make us think in a profound way about, what religion can do with organization around it and what spirituality is, aside from that and separately from that. So it's very interesting in that sense.
I don't want to spoil it too much for the audience, but one of my many, many strong impressions, yes, there are the acrobats and all that, which are terrific, but the way the opera sort of slows down in the later parts of the opera, as things calcify, as he becomes immured, in other words, walled in politically, socially, logistically, everything in the production and in the music moves toward a different pace. And that to me was fascinating because I didn't expect it. I didn't, this was a case where I didn't get the score before and study it. I just decided to go with it without preparation. I'm not, I know the works of Philip Glass. I don't claim any expertise the way I do, say, in Verdi or Wagner, but therefore I can approach it as a student. And that was something really wonderful. I'm being mindful of your time because you are a busy man. I want to get back briefly to the Enchanted Island because I just thought it was terrific. And it was, not everyone loved it, but it was a pasticcio that combined many different arias from the Baroque era with many different characters, and it was drawn loosely from Shakespeare's The Tempest. And it had two countertenors, David Daniels and you. You later played his role. And then it had fabulous mezzos, Susan Graham, Joyce DiDonato. Luca Pizzaroni was a wonderful scene stealer as Caliban. It was terrific. Did you ever see it from the auditorium to have a sense? And Placido Domingo, by the way, was Neptune. Did you ever and Danielle Denise was in it. It was just an amazing production and cast.
Yeah.
Did you ever see it from the auditorium and have a sense of what it looked like and what we experienced?
I did. I went to all of these technical rehearsals and I saw how brilliantly I thought it was rendered. There was all of this projection mapping, which was quite exciting, especially at the time when we had not seen a lot of that. And some of the incredible costumes by Kevin Pollard and the way that they were executed were just thrilling. And, there were flashes of fire and there were mermaids. I remember Placido's entrance sequence. Mermaids came down and floated and we were all of a sudden under the ocean. And there was this wild, trippy kind of video on a scrim that took us there. And then all of a sudden the scrim lifted and there was Placido in a huge clamshell, with a chorus.
Doing it was his best Bette Midler.
Yes, exactly. It was so over the top in a way that was really, really wonderful. So
I hope that comes back. That must be a hard thing to stage, but I hope it comes back. It was just terrific.
Well, thank you.
And it leads in a strange. Well, actually, I want to ask you before we get to Justin Vivian Bond. I love dogs, and Tilda Swinton did a video of dogs on a beach, and you were singing Rompo I Lacci from Handel's Flavio. Talk about that project.
Well, Glass Handle was a project I created around my first album, which you can listen to on all of the streaming platforms or buy. And it's a combination, it juxtaposes music of Philip Glass and of Handel. But in order to create digital assets and excitement about it, I asked 9 different filmmakers as a part of a larger multimedia performance to create music videos that expressed the music however they felt it or saw it. And Tilda Swinton was one of the filmmakers who agreed to do this. And she was the sort of joy of the fioratura in Rompo I Lacci made her think of her dogs frolicking on the beach. And so she took all of this footage of them and edited it together. And it looks almost as if they're choreographed. And it is very joyful, and it certainly got a lot of traction when it came out. Whoever would have thought that was how you see Rompo I Lacci, but it's a great example of why I always ask people outside of the world of opera to, put their artistic stamp in some way on what we see, because it gives us a new perspective.
So, and this leads to someone else from outside the world of opera, Justin Vivian Bond. Talk about her, talk about your collaboration, and how did it start? And did it become what you thought it would, or did it become something else?
I think Vivian and I have known each other for 10 years. I saw them perform maybe even before that. And I was immediately struck by them being the most charismatic performer I've ever seen. And I thought, wow, this goes beyond Mick Jagger, anything else I've seen in my lifetime, even on the operatic stage. And so I immediately approached her and I said, could we perform together? And slowly we developed an onstage relationship. It was quite electric, and we both look very different from the way we sound. And we represent different dichotomies of high and low, uptown, downtown, high voice, low voice, tall, short, you name it. And Vivian one day said to me, well, it's kind of, we should do something like Carol Burnett and Julie Andrews at Carnegie Hall. And of course, that made me think of Carol Burnett and Beverly Sills, Bubbles and Burnett at the Met. And I just loved this idea that we could find humor.
A show that I worked.
Did you work it? Were you a part of that? Oh my gosh,
Whoa.
How amazing.
If you cook, I'll bring the wine.
Okay, great. I can't wait to hear those stories. So, yeah, and it was, it was one of the most fulfilling experiences I've had. It's very hard. It's very hard to be yourself in any context, but as a gay man who sings classical music, how do you put your identity into the music? You can do it with style, you can do it with, some sense of honesty in who you are coming through, but actually to express your identity with a project, and with the project at a very high level, creating it with the director and our co-creator, Zach Winokur, and all of the people who worked on the show itself at St. Anne's. Thomas Bartlett, the record producer and our musical guru who sort of created it with us, having all of these people create something at such a high level with us and release it on Universal Music with this beautiful packaging. It really, and then for it to become a hit, it was named on every best of list, whether it was the New York Times Theater list or the Washington Post Classical Music or the Time Out, Matrix at the end of the year. For it to be such a hit, for it to resonate so deeply with so many people was incredibly gratifying. So the album is out and you can listen to how we fuse classical and popular styles. But the show hopefully will be back in a bigger and better form soon.
And the title is Only an Octave Apart.
That's right. And we stole that from Beverly Sills and Carol Burnett, who sang that number at the top of their show. We're only an octave apart. So that was the jumping off point.
So I know we need to conclude, but you mentioned Mick Jagger. He loved opera. He loves opera. I don't know if you know that. And Keith Richard, in his memoir, described Mick Jagger as a cross between James Brown and Maria Callas, which I think is a kind of perfect description. In all my years working at the Met, at La Scala, and other opera companies, I've met heads of state, many famous people. I'm completely an egalitarian and I treat everyone the same. But I will confess that when Mick Jagger came to the Met one night to attend Tosca, and he had a question, and he was sent to me, I was speechless.
Yeah.
I barely could get the words out, but he is an extraordinary performer. It's interesting that you would mention him as an example of someone who owns the stage.
Yeah.
And you own the stage. But the great thing about you, among many, is, as I mentioned at the top of our conversation, you are a beloved collaborator. And when I talk to people in our profession and they talk about people they love to work with rather than sing backup for or surround, your name always appears.
Oh, well, that's so kind. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm going to let you go unless there's something else you want to add, because I know you are a busy, busy man and you're doing an opera in 2 days that we will hear after you do it, and you were terrific.
Well, thank you. And it's such a joy to talk to you and your knowledge and openness. So thank you again, and thank you to all the listeners who keep Fred going. We love you.
We love you too. Thank you, and I love my listeners and my engineer Johan, without whom I could not do this. So Anthony, toi toi toi. See you soon.
See you soon. Thank you.